This week, I want to start out with sharing a piece called Possible Hysteresis, the longer-term after effects of the pandemic. Go to our website, www.value-ability.com, and under the Content tab, under Document Links, will be a link to this piece. It delves into some of the after effects, obviously, of the pandemic. And I thought it was an interesting title because Simonson and I have a running gag about vocab words. And even this vocab word I had to look up because you would think, Philip, hysteresis would have something to do with hysteria, right? That it would have that same root. It's actually not. It's really almost the opposite. Hysteresis is when the value of a physical property lags behind the changes in the effect causing it. For example, when you have magnetic induction lagging behind the magnetic force that is causing that. So it's a word used primarily in physics and science. And the point of this piece is that it's going to be a slow recovery out of the pandemic, but it will be a recovery is the main underlying theme of the piece. Now, it is eligible for CFP, continuing education credit. So when you go to the link that is posted on our website, it will have you put in your CFP information so you can get CFP continuing education credit for this piece. And it dovetails very nicely with our topic this week of patience, because coming out of this global event is going to require patience at every level. Patience from companies, patience from financial advisors, patience from investors and individuals. So with that, we will start episode 47 of the Valuability Podcast, Patience. The Valuability Podcast is for financial professionals, business owners, and anyone interested in financial planning, business, leadership, and personal development. We believe that financial success comes from building a plan on the foundation of your values, and building your ability will help you get there. My name is Danforth Fleek. I've been in the financial services business for over 20 years as a financial advisor and product wholesaler. I'm joined each week by my co-host, friend, and mentor, Philip Simonson, who has been in financial services for 40 years as a financial advisor, field leader, sales trainer, and senior manager, covering areas such as advisor development and field operations. Now, Philip, you've been on my personal patience journey with me from almost the very beginning. You saw the unformed piece of clay that you got back in the mid-90s. And now I actually have to mention one of my very good friends I talk to every day from high school. We actually went to college together and actually had our first job together right before I came to Financial Network back in the day to work with you. We were chatting about honesty, and I had mentioned our conversation where we mentioned it on the podcast earlier episode, little white lies that I told around things, and how you basically just called me out right away. And Leah said to mention that, Philip, you are awesome and she loves you. So
Very kind. Very kind. In this one, it's how would I phrase it? It's a British term. I think that's where I learned it, and I loved it. It goes, look, doesn't suffer fools gladly. And I would use that as one way of describing you when I first met you. You had zero tolerance. Now that
it's very little patience.
Very little patience.
Very little patience. Absolutely
right?
true.
And on the left-hand side of that continuum, there's zero patience. On the right-hand side, 180 degrees difference. Someone who's got as they say, the patience of Job, right?
Right.
You were definitely way over on the left-hand side. But great progress has been made on that. You're definitely over the 45-degree angle. You are now on that other side. Or 90-degree angle, I'd even put you. You're on that other side of the 90 degrees. That's
Yeah, don't know that I'm quite Job yet, but definitely has overall improved my life. Well, the thing behind that too is that living that way isn't particularly fun.
no, it's not healthy. You're never really going to find happiness. We're
Very
going
very
Yeah,
unhealthy.
very
Yeah,
unhealthy. We're going to talk about that. And I thought, well,
right.
that tees it up. Here's what, let's, can just have a conversation. But I thought, let's start with, let's define patience, why it's important to have it. You've already alluded to it, just about one's health. How important is patience as a virtue? Then what's its purpose? And I would like to take what's its purpose and bring it into the valuability, why we even came up with our name. You know, this whole one of the main contexts of us, you and I, delivering these podcasts is to help people help themselves through a values based approach so that they can make better decisions and live more in alignment to the things that are important to them. And they'll do that by making better decisions, ultimately, as learning how to manage themselves. And if you can't manage yourself, we'll talk more about this too. It's very difficult then to lead and manage others, family members, or even if you're, mother or father, or partner, or, most importantly, if your clients, if you're a business leader and running your own practice. So I thought we'd put it in that context and just go from there and have a conversation about it. But I thought, why don't we just first start off with, what is patience? How does the dictionary define it?
Absolutely. That's a great place to start.
All right, I'll read it to you and read it to the audience. Patience, or they say in comma, forbearance, is the ability to endure difficult circumstances. Patience may involve perseverance in the face of delay, semicolon, tolerance of pro- someone provoking you without responding, in the key, in a disrespectful or being angry with them. Um, or forbearance when under strain, especially when faced with the longer term difficulties. Patience is the level of endurance one can have before disrespect, just because the opposite is being disrespectful. And it's also referred to as a character trait of being steadfast. Now, when I was getting ready for this session, I also looked at patience. What did from the great wisdom teachers of going back from Hinduism to Buddhism to Judaism to Christianity. And I even looked at it from a psychology and a cognitive neuroscience. And let's start with the psychology and neuroscience. It says patience is studied as a decision making problem of involving the choice of either a small reward in the short term versus a more valuable reward in the long term. You and I talk about this quite a bit, learning to live with long term delayed gratification. Now, this whole thing about patience and goes back to, and if you can become more patient and live with delayed gratification, to a study. And there's been, and I'm going to give you the two studies on it. The first one, it was probably, I wish I knew the date, late 80s, early 90s. I think it might have even been 60 Minutes, and also Time Magazine. They called it emotional competence. But it was, and then all the writings and books on that, besides the Time Magazine article, emotional competence became very, very popular. But the study was, and if you might recall this, they had the young kindergartners. And they're all in a room and they're playing, and the teacher goes, "Now, I have to leave the room, children. And I'm going to put this plate of marshmallows on the center table here. And when I come back now from a little break I'm going to take, we can all enjoy the marshmallows. Leaves the room, cameras are rolling. Well, of course, there's little Johnny. He can't wait. He's got to go up. He grabs the marshmallows. He's chomping down. And then, they did a certain percentage, and I'm not going to make it up. Go to the school of MSU and make, make, was it SH something up on the fly? Well, we won't do that. But long and short, they ended up studying these students, young children at the time, for the next 20 years. And those little Johnnies who couldn't live with delayed gratification, they didn't have a very successful life. And successful meaning, a fulfilling career. They've been married once, twice, three times. They just their net worth, everything was very low in regard to those children who could hold off on the short-term gratification and wait for the bigger term.
Wasn't there a prize for delay? Didn't they could either have one at that time or they could get more later? I think there was an element of that where they could, hey, we're going to put this here. If you want to have one, but just know you only get one. Or if you wait, you come back and you get two. And so they kind of tracked the kids that could put off that gratification for the higher,
the more valuable reward if you could wait for the long term. Yes. Yeah, great catch. I'm most certain it is. And now the fast forward, they've done another study. And the patience of human users in the online world has been the subject of much recent scientific research. And the one I'll quote from is the 2012 involving tens of millions of users who watched videos on the internet. And it's Krishnan and Sitaraman show that online users lose patience in as little as 2 seconds while waiting for their chosen video to start playing. 1,000, 2 1,000, boom. Or 1 Mississippi, 2 Mississippi. They're already impatient. The study also shows the users who are connected to the internet at faster speeds are less patient than their counterparts connected at slower speeds, demonstrating a link between the human expectation of speed and human patience.
That I understand, because as my internet speed has gone up, I often think, man, I used to have to wait minutes for an image of this size to load. And now if it doesn't load instantly, I get frustrated, start to feel that frustration build. So, but that's also the theory of rising expectations, right? Like the more that you get, the more you expect.
Well, that's right, Dan. That's exactly right, because that's what they're concluding on this. The rapid pace of technology is rewiring our brains to be less and less patient. And think about when you lose your impatience, you get frustrated, you get angry. The amygdala hijack takes over, as we know and we talked about, and it's the fight, flight, or fight syndrome. And the cortisol gets released, and that's a brain inhibitor that blocks you from accessing that prefrontal cortex of the brain where decisions are made and rationality, etc. But if this is occurring and we're rewiring our brain like that, it's no wonder why these drive-by shootings are becoming more frequent, or people flipping each other off, cutting in front of each other, doing rude things. So practicing this in patience is the Proverbs, and I do love that book. It's got some very great wisdom, and wisdom is just applied knowledge. But the patient reminded me just this what we were talking about here. The patient man shows much good sense, but the quick-tempered man displays folly at its height.
I think the first thing that jumps out at me is, and this is almost certainly colored by my own experience, but the first thing that I think is that, to me, patience almost seems to be the absence of emotion, to
Mm.
be the delay of emotion. At least that's how it manifests itself in me. Is I still get those impulses, I still feel them, and we've talked about it previously on the podcast. You know, as I learned the cognitive behavior therapy methods of catching that process, the cavalcade of stupidity that I call it, where there's, you know, one thing leads to another, and I'm in a rush, and I'm hungry, and so on and so forth. And there's just these layers of things that build up. That when I get that trigger to begin feeling those things, I notice it, and I can essentially just steer away from those thoughts and feelings by going to my little internal mantra, my
Mm-hmm.
good memory, my music, the piece of music that I keep as my positive, you know, space essentially. But to me, and I suppose those are emotions actually, right?
They are.
I am replacing them with emotions, but they're not these overwhelming, just massive sweeps of, as you say, the cortisol getting released into your brain and the red flooding my vision, and, you know, very, very overwhelming when that anger takes a hold of me. And so to me, I feel of it almost as just delaying that. And then as you find out, when you delay things, you realize, oh, there's this one small thing, and this happens all the time with me when it's something physical, right? Like a cord is stuck on something, or I'm actually, I don't think we talked about this on the podcast at any time. I was out watering the lawn, or no, leaf blowing, and I had my leaf blower. I was in, my cord got stuck. The electric leaf blower cord got stuck, and I was snapping it to try and get it off the thing that it was stuck on, and it wouldn't come out. Instead of walking back over and figuring out what it was, I just
done that.
Did it as hard as I could, slipped out of my hand, went up in the air, came down on my forehead, and ripped a big hole in my head.
I remember that.
Yeah, this was maybe 4 or 5 months ago, right at the beginning of winter here. And if you steer away from that anger, steer away from that frustration, you find that detail that makes you say, oh, well, of course, taking this road of being, you know, of brute force isn't going to work. The cord had actually gotten stuck down in a piece of landscaping plastic. It wasn't just up next to the plastic. It was actually wedged down in the plastic. Small, minor detail, but has a huge difference. But you often find this, and it's the same with decision making when it comes to, you know, investing or anything else.
Hold on,
business planning.
Hold on to that. You are absolutely right. But you bring up any good points, and let's go back to a couple of them. First, yes, you do feel emotions. We're hardwired as creatures, as human beings, to respond emotionally first, and they come from the external stimuli, just like, you know, that cord being stuck. And you can know this: emotions serve a purpose because they're your reactions to the world around you, and you know they're coming from somewhere. And what happens is those emotions come in and to the brain, and and stimulated by them. And you also can know this: those who love you know exactly which triggers to push, because we're hardwired, and what we're having to learn how to do is to rewire ourselves and how to respond. And that's what you've been able to do and get better at it. And we all can. And that's going to come back to, I wanted to go through some other things around social awareness skills, etc. But first and foremost here, what you can do is, those emotions come in, and it's either sad, glad, or mad. And what we have found out in the studies is that 2/3 of the people, when you're in that high emotional, angry state, 2/3 of the people, if you think about an exponential triangle on the lower left-hand side, that's your emotions. At the apex on the top, that's your thoughts. And then on the lower right-hand side, or 180 degrees difference from emotions, is your behavior. 2/3 of the people go from feeling the emotion, sad, glad, or mad, which most of them come down to actually then responding to it without stopping to think. And that's where you're saying, like, the decision making, because what the beauty of emotions and why emotions are important to us, patience helps you to become empathetic, and by building empathy to others, it's it's important to you because it's going to help you live more of a hassle-free life. You're not going to let it take control of your emotions and your behaviors. You're going to put it in the right category, like you were describing. And because if you get irritated by a crying baby or a loud child playing in front of you, you got to think about developing your patience, because patience is going to help you build better empathy towards others. And so it requires bottom line, it's going to require self-control. And people who have good insight into thinking and being able to have more self-control, what studies show, they're people who have, register higher on the happiness scale. Uh, and here's a good one. I was just, for example, instead of if living with that delayed gratification or being able to postpone telling someone, we've all had this, instead of telling someone or a secret or blowing a surprise that would make someone very happy, patience will help you wait it out and see the secret or surprise through. But those who can't live with it, forget it. It reminds me of a little joke of my father, or one of his sayings. He says, I can keep a secret, but it's those I tell that cannot.
Right.
But irrelevant to what we're talking about here. So that purpose of the patience, is to act upon what our talents, passions, souls, and our mind are whispering for us to do. And what we got to do is learn how to listen to it and press the pause button before we actually react, like the 2/3 of the people do, and go up to thinking. And Dan, you're a historian. Think of how many words. I don't know. I'm not going to ask, I don't expect you to know this, but we could Google it, and there's an old saying that words have killed more people than swords.
Right.
Right.
Pen is mightier than the sword.
Yeah, the pen is mighty. So what did Lincoln do, Dan? When it comes to patience and learning decision making, what did Lincoln do? What was he, besides many things, but when he was angry at his generals? Let me get more specific. What was he known to do?
Yeah, wouldn't he? You tell this story quite a bit. You're testing my
I went with
my
the what
son
question.
paying attention to dad quotient here. Didn't he used to write letters and then he would put them in the drawer overnight and then read them the next day?
Yeah. First thought wrong, right? When you're acting in, out of a high emotional, positive or negative states, usually the first thought is wrong. So very good. Yeah. He would just put them in the drawer, and then he would wait 24, 48 hours, read it. If it still served its purpose, then he would send it off by mail.
I don't do that overnight with texts, but when I get, as an example, I was in a conversation with one of my tenants about another tenant in the building, and tenant A was complaining about tenant B and wasn't happy with the fact that I was just basically saying, well, look, they have a right to enjoy their apartment, and I'm sorry that, essentially it was that they were watching movies late at night and he could hear their TV. Sure. And I'm like, I'm sorry that they're watching movies in their apartment, but they're not having a party or leaving their door open. There's nothing I can do about them quietly enjoying watching a movie just because you can hear it upstairs and it bugs you. And so we started to get more and more heated, and I started writing some rather snotty things. But what I've started doing in those situations is I'll type the text, and then I almost immediately just erase it. And then I'll put down my phone and I'll come back and I'll rewrite the same text, but typically it's a little more measured 5 or 10 minutes later.
Yeah.
But even that level of detachment definitely changes the tenor of a conversation.
Good for you, because it's hard to take back those words once they've been released, right? And same thing. We've talked about this before. Judges, what's the first lesson they're taught? Do you recall that one?
Right? That's the don't do the sentencing at the same time as the verdict.
Comes in because you're too emotional. So step back. And we used to teach, and sometimes we still do. And let me just go through an exercise with you right now. And I wish if our audience could visualize and think about this. And it's all about, first of all, self-awareness. And think we're going to starting at the bottom of that pyramid and moving up again. And the first level is, learning to become more self-aware. And it's your ability to accurately perceive your own emotions in the moment. And then understand your tendencies across those situations. Key there is understand your tendency across those situations, because boy, it's those mental maps you have, the routine, the pattern, they're going to come in. So now you want to become more cognizant of them, and by becoming more conscious or cognizant, now you're going to be able to make better choices, and that leads to and decisions, because better self-awareness leads to more effective decision making. And effective decision making leads to better self-management. And self-management is what happens when you act or do not act. It is clearly dependent on your self-awareness. So self-management is your ability to use your awareness of your emotions to stay flexible and direct your behavior positively. And effective self-management, if you can then all of a sudden learn to manage yourself better, that's going to help you become a better leader and demonstrate better leadership and influencing skills. Because I would suggest to anyone listening, if you can't, if you've got poor self-awareness skills, you're gonna have poor decision making. And if you demonstrate poor decision making, well, then, why should I listen to you? Because you can't even manage yourself.
Well, I think it's very important to go back to the previous triangle you were talking about with emotions, thoughts, and behaviors.
Yeah.
Many times, if you don't exhibit patience, there's no decision making. It's not decision making. It's just emotional reaction. And that in and of itself is a form of decision, but you're not making any really cognitive, conscious decision.
Well, if you haven't responded to your behavior, you're not. So if you're what do I call?
You're just an animal at that
Well,
point. I mean, you're
thank
literally
you.
just reacting as an animal.
Well, but yes, you own those decisions, and whether or not you made them consciously or unconsciously. But the key, what you're just describing, is the game played 6 inches between the ears, which differentiates us from the human beings. So we're the ones, that cluster of all those thoughts, that self-talk, we control it. We give it control, or we can take away the control of it.
I mean, in and of itself, like I mentioned, no decision is a decision.
Yes, I would still
right.
Yes,
like you're not making it I'm choosing to do this really, but it still is a decision in the overall scheme of things because you are reacting to it.
And I would suggest, not knowing the context of it, but no decision is still a decision, like you're saying. Well, that probably, particularly if you're angry, or you could be exuberant too. Dopamine gets released, and I'm not going to be buying into this GameStop and and putting everything in there. No decision might be a good decision. Might be an excellent decision.
On the other side of things, too, it could be, right?
Yeah.
It could be. Usually it's the opposite, though. Usually it's the anger and violence emotions. That's also one of the things that really made me turn the corner, is that outside of those situations where I would lose my temper, I was never somebody that used or thought of violence or
Right.
intimidation or anger as a method of solving anything. And so when I really stepped back and started to look at my own behaviors and say, when has that ever solved anything for you? I can think of maybe one or two times where I was getting bullied, where being strong slash aggressive slash violent set me up in a situation where I wasn't bullied any longer.
Hmm.
But more often than not, it exacerbated the issue. I can, in fact, think of only two situations in my entire life where having that kind of reaction had a positive outcome later. And even then, I still had this residue of, well, now they think I'm the crazy guy that will snap at any moment. They may be leaving me alone, but they think I'm the wacko. And so
Served
that wasn't
served a purpose.
great either.
Yeah, but no buts to it. But what we're coming back to the core here with this patience and learning patience is a virtue. It helps you increase your self-management skills. And one of the things you and I have been wanting to do with this podcast, or with these podcasts, shall I say, and in our blogs, etc., is to help is is help people get a good understanding of this self management. So then, this knowledge, without it, it's really hard to adjust your behavior. But with it, then when you can manage yourself, well, then you're going to be living more intentional. You're going to be more intentional about. Rod was always it's living with intentionality. Rod, one of our guests around the air, he was big on that one, and he was right, because you're going to be more intentional about your lives, and if you're more intentional and you're living in alignment with your values and your goals, and you're making better decisions, well, you're going to be happier and you're going to perform at a higher level because you're going to be in alignment. And you're getting, a lot of those, what was it, sportscasters, if I reflect back, they say, oh, that person's in the zone. Well, what they're really referencing, when they're in the zone, that's when they're in alignment. What's important to them internally is in aligned with what their goals are and how they're in their decision making at that given moment. And that's probably when it's very difficult. As my, Doug Lennox, my old mentor, and Doug too. I love his phrase, and it was always, and I've said it many times, but it's simple in concept, but not necessary easy in implementation. Meaning here, being self-aware. If you are consciously self-aware, then you're more than likely living in the moment, and that's not always easy to do. And just a couple other thoughts on this, Dan, and we can, you know, go to we got a couple questions this week, but it's
Mm-hmm.
right. But yeah, I said I was going to do explain social awareness. So we talked about self awareness. Now, social awareness, it's your ability to accurately pick up on emotions in other people and understand what is really going on with them. And this often means perceiving what the other people are thinking and feeling, even if you do not feel the same way. Now, you're not going to get there without patience, being able to pick up on the tonality, the nonverbals of the other person or people across from you or the audience unless you have this patience. And if you're not, can't be socially aware, well, then you're not going to necessarily be able to make the self-management and make those adjustments to meet people where they are. And that leadership comes down to, you and I've just said this many times on these podcasts, one word, and that's influence. So great. You picked it. It was one of the ones you wanted to talk about. And I thought, well, then I started looking up the definition. I remember, holy cow. Yeah, Doug taught me a lot about this one in regard to the behavioral advice. So,
well, I've got one last thought before
Sure.
we wrap up our main section. We've talked about before some of my experiences in acting, and I think this dovetails very nicely with that concept. When you're breaking down a script to perform, you're taught that being things doesn't read well on stage. Being on stage, you have to project and communicate things across space. Television's a much more intimate, film is much more intimate because the camera's right up in your face. And so you can communicate things with the twitch of an eye or just a look or, very, very small things. But on stage, it's huge. So you have to, project your communication out. Always, you're taught back to the back of the auditorium, right? You're talking to somebody who's standing in the lobby is what they tell you. And so they teach you to break down a script by finding active verbs. You can't be happy, right? What does that even mean? How do you be happy? You can shine. That gives you an idea of actionability and intentionality. And I think the same thing applies to this concept of patience, that patience is the observable effect of your own self-awareness and control of your emotions. And it's really not kind of a character trait. It is a character trait, but not an actual internal thing that happens. It's something that is observed in you from the outside.
Yeah, because people with high in self-awareness, what I've seen, they're remarkably clean, Dan, in their understanding of what they do well, what motivates them, satisfies them, and certainly know which people and situations know how to push their buttons. Right? And this whole self-awareness thing, and I'm reaching behind here, and I just remembered because I was looking at this in my research. Can you see this one, Dan?
Oh, yeah.
And to our audience, it's the Emotional Intelligence 2.0. And it's by give a shout out to Travis Bradbury and Gene Graves, who put this together. It's a book, and self-awareness is a foundational skill. And when they did I don't know how many people they studied, it's thousands, but as the self-awareness increases, people satisfaction with life, defined as their ability to reach their goals at work and at home, skyrockets. Self-awareness is so important, they found out, for job performance that 83% of the people with high in self-awareness are top performers, and just 2% of the bottom performers are high in self-awareness. So it's a skill that can be learned.
Well, and the last thing too that I jotted down is that oftentimes you find, especially if it's a crisis or a perceived crisis in business or investing or, any kind of work related or, finance related subject, having that ability to pause and allow things to play out, you often find that the issues resolve themselves. Something pops up that you think back, oh, well, if I had snap reacted to that, I would have created this whole other avenue of things that we would have to have dealt with. And yeah, I'm not suggesting the management of doing nothing style of management is effective, but allowing things to develop to see what naturally takes care of itself does oftentimes things will pop up. Someone else will pop up and say, oh, I've been working on this, or the customer realizes that, oh, this isn't as big of an issue. And so, a lot of times, especially small business owners, you get these crisis situations and you throw yourself into it. You do all this work and then you come back and the situation has resolved itself. And so having a bit of that, as you say, pause for cause, see how things develop, not suggesting that you ignore things, but hey, let's let things develop. So that will bring us to the end of our main section. Another very interesting conversation about values. We've got 2 more, discipline and humility, and we will touch a little bit more on that at the end of the episode. So moving on to our question segment. First question. I have been at my new job for 3 weeks, and my manager emailed me that he made a mistake in the offer letter regarding my salary, and he is cutting that salary. How should I respond?
Well, some alarm bells are going off in my head, and the first one is the fact,
Absolutely.
right? The first one, in fact, that he or she, being the leader, emailed this person and did not have the courage to talk to them in person. That would give me cause for thinking about, I got to get out of here. This but not everyone can just pack up and leave. So
Right.
because they need that income to pay their bills. So if that happens to be the case here, and this was, there's nothing in handwriting or, with the offer letter stating what the salary is, you got to determine, look, I got to suck this thing up. We talked about patience here today. Just be able to live with yourself, live with the situation, give it your best while you're still there. But I wouldn't hesitate to start looking and find another place to hang my hat. And the best time to control role perception, do you accept these tasks as part of your job? Best, this salary, this bonus structure, this work environment is during the selection process. There shouldn't be any more surprises after you're hired. And the fact that there are surprises here gives me cause to believe this is probably not a good environment to hang your hat to use that term once again, for the long term. So suck it up, live with it, start, dust off your resume, clean it up. You can explain this one away very easily.
Yeah, there's certainly first and foremost, there's a legal issue. If you have a signed offer letter, you could pursue that avenue. The answer, of course, is that these kind of things happen because the managers know that they can get away with it, right? That taking legal action is expensive and finding a lawyer takes time, and most people are just not going to go down that road unless there's just some egregious violation otherwise, that kind of layers on top of that, or they just say again.
I was going to say, or the reward has to be big enough to go through all this effort, because everything today, if you put file a lawsuit against your employer, well, everything shows up out there on the internet now,
Right.
and it's not worth it. Geez, if he's willing to, or she's willing to file a lawsuit against the former employer, what's going to stop him or her from filing for me? That would red lights should be going on. So it's
Sure.
not worth it, as you said. As most of it's pretty. The payback is not going to be worth it.
Yeah, the cost benefit in these situations just ends up being exactly as you said. Like, look, if you have the ability, if you're single, young, got a little bit of money saved because you were going to be, obviously switching jobs, and you had saved up some money, just walk. You don't owe them anything. They're reneging on their offer letter. Pack up your stuff and leave. If you're older, you have a family, you have responsibilities, you have people to feed, as you mentioned, gut it out for the time being. But I agree. I don't see any kind of, hey, let's sit down and work this out, just from the way that it was posed, the timing of when it was posed, the fact that it just looks like blatant manipulation. So, second question for the week, also really a relationship question. As we were chatting before, Philip says, "Why are you turning me into Dear Abby?" And I reminded him of his oft-repeated phrase that we are social workers by heart. But also related to things that we would discuss, how can I encourage my partner to disclose his financial status, savings, investments, debts, so we can plan our futures together? We have been together for 10 years, and I'm financially independent, own my own home, and have modest investments. I'll start out with this one. The first thing that pops to mind is, if you are certain that you heck or high water are going to continue this relationship, a financial advisor could navigate this. You could do a financial plan for a couple where you're not disclosing all information in front of each other. You could sit down with each person individually. You could build a plan together. Now, as you then present that plan, there are going to be some obvious things that could be deduced from that, but this certainly could be navigated from a purely technical standpoint, right? And if there is some overarching reason why this person doesn't want to disclose this information, but the second part of this is emotional, relationship based, personal, again, alarm bells start going off. Why are they being so closed? Why are they not? You're not asking them to merge your finances. You're just asking them to talk about finances. So either there's something big in their finances that they don't want you to know about for negative reasons, or they have severe trust issues. And both of those things make me say, run like Benji.
I'd agree. I'd put my training shoes on and run the other way so fast. This is not a relationship, but and everything's good up until the but. They have, in this case, I'd say, look, they've been together for 10 years, so there's something. Each one of them are getting something out of this relationship. But I would just encourage this person to sit down and say, hey, look, we got to have an open, honest, frank, confidential conversation around where we stand financially, where you stand financially, and where I stand, and where we, and plan out our future. Because how can we plan out our future together without discussing the finances? For examples, just as you said, do the planning. When can we retire? How can finances are one piece of the puzzle of a relationship, but I got to tell you, it is one of the top three that causes divorce. So if you're thinking about a long-term relationship here, this should be on the table. Not put the training shoes on.
Absolutely. And that is going to wrap up our question section for this week. If you have topics that you would like us to cover or questions for us to answer in a future episode, email us at info@value-ability.com. Again, that's info@value-ability.com. Or you can reach out to us through social media. Our links to Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook accounts are at value-ability.com under the Contact Us tab. Wherever you find us, please like, review, subscribe, and share. If you have not yet subscribed and you are a regular listener, please take the time to track down a spot where you can subscribe to us. It really, really helps us out. Next episode, episode 48, Assessing Risk. We have a very special guest. Dr. Rolf Schmelzle from Michigan State University is a professor who works primarily in the field of health risk and communicating those risks. He is going to come on and chat with us about some of his research and education. We're also going to continue on with our values-based episodes. We have discipline and humility coming up after our episode with Dr. Schmelzle, so definitely check back. What questions about assessing health risks do you have for us? Reach out to us before next week when we record this next episode and let us know so we can ask Dr. Schmelzle your questions. As always, thank you for listening. Be sure to join us next week. And remember that financial success comes from building a plan on the foundation of your values, and building your ability will help you get there. This is a podcast collaboration, not a peer-reviewed journal or a sponsored publication. We make no representations as to accuracy, completeness, correctness, suitability, or validity of any information in this podcast, and will not be liable for any errors, omissions, or delays in this information, or any losses, injuries, or damages arising from its display or use. All information is provided on an as-is basis. It is the listener's responsibility to verify their own facts. You should be aware of the real risk of loss in following any strategy or investment discussed on this podcast. Strategies or investments discussed may fluctuate in price or value. Investors may get back less than invested. Investments or strategies mentioned on this podcast may not be suitable for you. This material does not take into account your particular investment objectives, financial situation, or needs, and is not intended as recommendations appropriate for you. You must make an independent decision regarding investments or strategies mentioned on this podcast. Before acting on information on this podcast, you should consider whether it is suitable for your particular circumstances and strongly consider seeking advice from your own financial or investment advisor. The views and opinions expressed on this podcast are those of the authors and do not necessarily reflect the official policy or position of any other agency, organization, employer, or company. Assumptions are not reflective of the position of any entity other than the authors, and since we are critically thinking human beings, these views are always subject to change, revision, and rethinking at any time. Please do not hold us to them in perpetuity.